a cartoonist writing about cartooning said that cartoonists are motivated by moral outrage. Well, there's also fear, of course. I mean, there's fear of deadlines and fear of being kind of found out and fear of failure and all of that kind of, because a lot of us are sort of filled with angst and all of that. But I think what really drives us is moral outrage.
Jonathan Shapiro is a political cartoonist whose judgment on the world appears weekly in black and white. Because he has no holy cows, no one escapes unscathed.
Done, I think. Bound to make a few people pretty cross and some others pretty happy. That's how it goes.
Even though Jonathan has outraged people all the way up to the president, he will not be silenced. He remains one of South Africa's strongest critical voices. Like many South African Jews, his family settled here over 100 years ago. He's about to embark on a journey to explore this lineage.
I keep on having that feeling of wanting to know what it was that made people make particular choices that they make. To leave somewhere, it's such a radical decision, to leave a place and go somewhere completely unknown halfway across the world. So that, you know, how dire was their situation? What did they know that they felt made it impossible for them? Amen. Okay. My identity, South African, perhaps Jewish next. When I grew up, I couldn't conceive of not going to shul on the festivals, of not observing. I had this sense of community that came from my Jewish background, my Jewish identity, and the shul. It's still got that fantastic cultural hold, and it's central for some people. For me, it's become very, very problematic. I think a lot about accident of birth, so that's why I don't like some aspects of the hold that it has on some people.
Jonathan's views on the Israeli government have put him into conflict with members of South Africa's mainstream Jewish community.
As Jews, we really, in our collective memory and in our individual families and everything, we have a huge understanding of what it is to suffer. And I feel strongly that we have to understand that not only in the context of our own families and our own Jewish communities suffering, but that should extend to understanding the suffering of other people.
Perhaps Jonathan inherited his sense of social justice from his late mother, Gaby Berglas, herself a political activist. His attorney father, Gershon, supported his wife's political activity with trepidation. Both his parents have passed away, so he returns to his childhood home in Rondebosch with his sister Yvonne to see what memories it evokes.
The first thing that I think of is all of us in the kitchen of the home I grew up in. This is the part that doesn't feel the same. It feels like a different room.
But our kitchen had a very specific energy.
Yeah, I mean, with the Argus stove there and that whole, it was that kind of nub of everything.
It was a hub of a place.
Yeah.
And you know,
we used to sit around playing games and talking, and my mom used to, being a night owl, used to hang out there at all hours, and sometimes we would stay up too late as well, actually. Oh wow, I haven't seen this. There are so many rooms, and these rooms were filled with all the stuff my mother kept. Yeah, so it still gets stuck. I think I'm not going to touch it with my shoulder, because all of us keep things. I mean, maybe it is in the genes or something. We've sort of like hamster genes. We keep everything. This room became the storage room for kind of Western Cape UDF.
yeah.
There used to be the boxes of T-shirts and leg warmers in UDF colours, and then
Hot water
ANC
bottle
colours,
covers.
hot water bottle covers.
Brooms.
At 56, Gaby was detained by the apartheid government for 6 weeks for political activism, as were Jonathan and Yvonne at different times. After the death of their parents, the children put the family's memorabilia into storage. Jonathan is going through some old family photographs, hoping to better understand why his mother made the choices she did.
This is Alfred. and his siblings and parents. And
Serious? I've never
yes,
seen this picture.
There's Alfred. Okay, that's Mom's dad.
Gaby and her two siblings were born to Emmy Kaplan and Alfred Berglas. By the 1930s, Alfred was an established textile merchant in Berlin. He ran a large company called Berglas Brothers, with his 3 brothers and 2 sisters. They owned textile mills in several European countries, and Alfred owned a holiday villa in Petzau.
You know, there was this gathering cloud, and they didn't really know. I mean, they just seemed to have. They had no clue. They were living in this
In their charmed life.
very, very charmed life with amazing circumstances. They're visiting Wannsee, but I get cold shivers every time I think of it. Wannsee,
Sure.
that's the place where the final solution was signed. All the top Nazis.
Happy Jewish family visiting Wannsee. That's a bit scary.
The final solution was the Nazi plan for Jewish genocide. One morning, when Gaby was just 7 years old, her mother was driving her to school. Her mother stopped their car in front of a traffic officer they were in the habit of waving to. In a hushed voice, he said to them, "What are you still doing here? Don't you know you have to get out?" This was May 1938, just months before the Holocaust began. To get a sense of his family's life in Berlin, Jonathan heads to London, where his sister and uncle are based.
There's been an element of detachment in my immediate family from some of the circumstances that people faced in Eastern Europe, the circumstances of the Nazi invasion and the Holocaust. I've just started to pick up what we might find there, and that is scary.
It's rare for Jonathan to get an opportunity to catch up with his sister Julia.
Welcome.
Thank you. Hello, sweetheart. Hello. Hey, my puppy. Hey.
Hi.
Do you know she looks so much like Mom? I've been looking at those photographs when Mom was about the same age.
That's younger.
I started to think about what actually has shaped me and why I'm feeling displaced at the moment. And in a way, I mean, I don't think it's unique for me to be feeling displaced at the moment in South Africa, because I think that our very core is being shaken around a bit, because a lot of the things that we fought for and we suffered to some extent for, I mean, not compared to a lot of other people, but are being tested at the moment.
I've lived outside South Africa for 10 years now, and it's changed my sense of identity. You know, our political commitment to South Africa and our interest in South Africa meant that we saw ourselves as South Africans and Africans. But it's not so simple, because our ancestors lived for centuries and centuries in this part of the world.
When Gaby and her family arrived in England, these successful business people were no more than refugees who had to rebuild their lives in a foreign land. Here, Gaby met Jonathan's father, who was in London completing his postgraduate studies. She moved to South Africa with Gershon to start a family. Gaby's brother David stayed in London, where he led something of the charmed life that runs in the family. He became a world-famous magician. Also true to his genes, David is an incorrigible hoarder.
These are fantastic. So now where do we start? I mean, do you remember the Olympics in 1936?
I have vivid memories of it, and it was the most incredible thing. In fact, we were sitting in quite comfortable seats, and literally less than 50 yards away was the balcony where Hitler was sitting. What I remember from the Olympics is the thrill of watching the Olympics. I was 10 years old, so I didn't have a lot of political ideas. We were always aware of Nazis marching and parades. Every street corner had a frame where they had the Nazi papers with terrible cartoons and terrible stories about Jews. And all that was taken away when the Olympics were going to be held in Berlin. They cleaned up Berlin for the outside world so that people wouldn't see what was going on, but they didn't fool a lot of people. And as soon as the Olympics were over, all this went back, of course. Now, my mother's parents, they were living in a small apartment on the 3rd floor in the center of Berlin. And they were still there about 9 months after we'd left, which was very late. And they received a phone call that the Gestapo were coming for them. And they literally, as the Gestapo were knocking on the front door, they clambered out of their back door by the kitchen, went down iron staircase like a fire escape, jumped in a taxi. My father had arranged for airplane tickets, and they arrived in London. I mean, it was really, really tight.
They didn't initially understand. They didn't understand the impending doom to the extent that it was actually there. And then everybody's lives changed and they went all over the world. And just to get the story from David was fantastic.
Gaby and David fled Berlin with their parents to start a new life. Like the rest of the Berglas family, they were fortunate enough to have the resources to escape. It's hard to believe that only one generation earlier, in the late 1880s, Salomon and Fanny migrated to Germany as humble egg and batter traders. Jonathan is traveling to Berlin to meet Ruth Leserowitz, who's been researching his family.
The place we are going now is a former trade quarter for foot traders, and it was very important in the beginning of the 20th century. And we have to go back to your great-grandfather, to Salomon Berglas, who lived with his family some years in this quarter and this street.
When Salomon and Fanny left Galicia, which is now part of Poland, they were enticed by the economic opportunities offered by the powerful new German Empire. They first lived in a poor Jewish area, Rochstrasse. From there, the family worked its way up into the slightly more affluent Food District.
The economy and the geography are totally intertwined in this little route. You can actually see the jumps.
Ruth and Jonathan are following the family's pattern of relocation where they moved westwards almost annually. By World War I, they'd accumulated enough capital to make the giant leap to the wealthiest suburb in West Berlin, where they remained until Salomon's death. By this time, Berglas brothers had built an impressive head office in Berlin's fashion quarter.
This yellow house was built by the Berglas brothers in 1929. And you should imagine, 1929, it was a year of the big economic crisis. I'm thinking about how they demonstrated their power, and it had influence to their position into the Berlin society, I think. And, you know,
the family's success was short-lived. In 1933, the Nazis launched a campaign against the Jewish fashion industry. As part of Hitler's plan of Aryanization, Jewish-owned businesses were systematically targeted and destroyed, or liquidated and taken over by Germans. By the start of World War II, the textile industry, which had been the second largest in Berlin, no longer existed. German women were encouraged to wear German fashions and Aryan underwear, eliminating all demand for Jewish ready-to-wear garments. Ruth is showing Jonathan the memorials commemorating what the industry once was.
And you see, it's in front of the business house of your grandfather.
It's very powerful as well too.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only the mirrors from the fashion industry, but you have to, in a way, confront yourself and your attitudes when you look in there.
Jonathan's next stop is the Landsarchiv, where Christoph Kreutzmüller has unearthed documents that detail exactly how the Berglas brothers' business was destroyed by the Nazis.
You got the brothers Berglas.
This is August 38.
Yeah. They're announcing that they are in the process of restructuring, i.e. of Aryanization. Yeah.
That's a euphemism.
Yeah, it's a euphemism, often used. And hang on, I hope I find it. Yeah, and that's the ones who did it. The Reichskreditgesellschaft, the Imperial Credit Society, which kind of took over all the shares. still 3 million then, and sold it to other people, sold it off. And they proudly announce here that the company has been given into Aryan hands.
In Irish,
Handed over. Yeah.
Handed over.
Yeah, and the old board has completely resigned, and there's now a new, wonderful board re-established.
Christoph has also curated a photographic exhibition on Jewish business in Berlin from 1933 to 1945, which explores Aryanization across several industries.
Actually, what you tell me about your family, and that's very, very typical. Like coming from Eastern Europe to Berlin and setting up a small egg business. A lot of people did. In 1933, like 95% of all the egg sellers in Berlin were Jewish. And then this is actually the reason why we focus on eggs. Then you get this completely absurd article in a Nazi paper, and it says, proudly says, again, we've got Aryan Easter eggs. I mean, what the hell is an Aryan Easter egg?
The absurd soon turned macabre. In the brutal 1938 anti-Semitic pogrom, Kristallnacht, Jewish businesses and synagogues were physically destroyed. Jewish men between the ages of 18 and 65 were rounded up and sent to concentration camps. Jonathan's family was lucky to escape, scattering across 4 continents. The family's headquarters and the monument to the textile industry remain, along with the archives documenting the company's destruction. The last place at which Jonathan can find a trace of this once powerful family is at the cemetery in Berlin, where Fanny and Salomon were buried in 1933.
It's almost wiped off.
The egg trader from Galicia and his wife, with the butter shop and the network.
They both died in the year that Hitler came to power.
Yes. She died earlier in February and then he in March.
That's 1 month apart.
Yes, and they died before, okay, the Reichstag have been burned, but it was before the first boycott of the shops. Their life ended before all this horror.
So they were lucky. They actually reached a reasonable age, and their children were well on the way, and they actually have a place that they're buried and a tombstone. The 2 of them are all that's left.
Unlike his mother's side of the family, Jonathan knows very little about his father's roots. Jonathan's father, Gershon, was the son of Charles Shapiro and Gertrude Levinson. Charles was the son of Hessel Leib Shapiro and Hinda Stupel, who all came to South Africa from the small town of Plunjan in Lithuania. Back in Johannesburg, Jonathan visits his great-aunt Lana, the custodian of this family history.
Hessel Leib came here, and I don't know the exact year that he came, but I can tell you that he was here at the time of the Jameson raid. That my mother told me. And she also told me he actually wrote the letters on the gravestones. He didn't chisel them out with the chisel, but he wrote on the gravestones there's Hebrew, and he wrote the letters.
Hessel Leib was a scribe who came to South Africa with many other young Lithuanian Jewish men. They were fleeing conscription into the Russian army as well as rising anti-Semitism, and were drawn to the economic possibilities of the newly opened gold and diamond fields. Hessel traveled back and forth between South Africa and Plunjan. It wasn't easy convincing his wife Hinda to make the journey to South Africa with their 3 children.
She was a big macher in Plunjan. I know everybody thinks that their parents were the aristocracy of their shtetl, without doubt. But she obviously did have quite a prestigious position there, and she didn't want to come. She knew that coming to South Africa, she would be any little immigrant, and she was not prepared for that.
Hinda finally accepted her lot as any little immigrant only when Lana's mother, Tsilla, got in with the wrong crowd. She was swept up as an idealistic Bolshevik at a time when the Russian Tsar was ruthlessly clamping down on the emerging left-wing threat. Hinda and the family joined Hessel Leib in Cape Town in 1907.
This is a photograph of the family in 1909. By this time, they had joined Hessel Leib. That's Charlie, and that is Hinda, and that's Tsilla, and that is Rose. And if you look on the back, he had written that on the back. And that tells you that's his handwriting. Yes, yes, absolutely.
Some of Hessel Leib's tombstone inscriptions can be seen in the Braamfontein Cemetery today.
Jacob Joseph Schiffers, 1895. And this is the relief kind. This is exactly the kind that they were talking about. So this is actually incredible. This must be my great-grandfather's actual handiwork. I don't really think I've had a connection with my great-grandfather Hessel Leib. This really is, I mean, I've always just seen him as this guy in a few pictures of the, founding the shul and a few sort of family photographs, but there's a sudden real connection.
When Hinda and the children joined Hessel, he was already settled in the Cape, like many other Jews who'd left the Transvaal during the Second South African War. Jonathan now goes to the Jewish Museum in Cape Town to speak to anthropologist Sally Frankenthal about the conditions the family might have faced on their arrival.
In terms of integrating, or whatever word one wants to use, on arrival, it's quite important to understand that they didn't know what they were coming to. So they were curious, they were adventurous, and they were cautious. They have a history. And even in the smallest little shtetl somewhere or other, Jews were literate. They studied. They knew their history. They carried memory. They told narratives down generations. And sadly, there is an ongoing strong theme of persecution of Jews, wherever. So they're cautious when they arrive in a new place. And what they needed to do in the first instance is what new immigrants need to do everywhere in the first instance, is survive. So they had to make a living. So what happens in a port city is people come in on a ship. And if they have contacts, there may be somebody there to meet them. And we think that the community, 2,000 people, 3,000 people, 4,000 people, I can't remember the exact figure, in 1904, were already organized enough to be meeting ships, to be meeting landslides, to be meeting homeboys and girls off those ships. And so they would settle in an area fairly close to the port because that was there. And that was District 6 in those early years. In that early period, we're talking about the early period, the great migrations of the sort of 1880s to 1918, end of World War I, roughly. Whatever skills they had, that was what they had. They didn't have goods. They didn't have capital. And then when they came here, what do you do if you can do nothing else? You look at the streets of Cape Town. If you can do nothing else, you take the little bit of cash that you've got, you go somewhere, you buy some stuff, you set up a stall and you sell it. And you hope to make a profit.
That's exactly what Hessel did. In Cape Town, he had become a successful shopkeeper. As an immigrant population, the lives of Jews were centered around their religion, and Hessel co-founded the Observatory Mowbray Synagogue, where Jonathan is meeting his brother-in-law, Mark Turok. This is one place where Jonathan feels deeply connected to his Jewish roots. He, his father and son all had their bar mitzvahs here, reading from the Torah donated to the shul by Hessel Leib.
Oh, careful. So maybe we can get to the bit that he may have written.
Yes.
Okay. How would one tell? You'd need a real expert to tell that this is written in someone else's hand. I'm just looking here. It actually goes slightly. Look, it's slightly different here at the very end. Look at that, it's getting bigger.
Yes.
Well, I would hope he's not. I would hope that's not Hessel.
Those are all turning like that. You see that? You see that? Those are turning like that.
As well as
and
the
this one is turning
lot.
like that.
Yeah.
Leib. He's right here on this photograph here from 1932.
That is the only image of, I mean, that's essentially the image of him that I've always, that I've grown up with. I don't know if he was always like that or if he's just sitting like that, but he's sitting there in this quite demure sort of way. And I think he must have been quite a strong personality himself to have done what he did. I can see some of my grandfather in him.
Your grandfather is
Charlie.
here.
That's Charlie. But look at the resoluteness of Charlie. You see, and Charlie was a very, very dogmatic, loud, strong personality.
Jonathan returns to London to explore the sea journey that Charlie took as a little boy. He meets Dr. Nick Evans, an expert on Litvak migration routes from Eastern Europe.
Right here we're going down onto Commercial Road, which will take you into the very heart of the city of London and close to the point at which the migrants would have arrived. The building in white in front of us originally looked like this, a building of the Poor Jews Temporary Shelter in London, and it opened in 1885 and helped wanderers who were travelling through London to South Africa, like your great-grandmother, your grandfather, and probably even your mother. We find under here Hinda Shapiro, your great-grandmother, who arrived with 3 children, including your grandfather Charles, and we know that she stayed in the shelter for 1 day on the 29th of August 1907 and then travelled to South Africa on the Gulf, and that's how she ended up in South Africa. Lots of migrants came to different British cities and then decided to go on to South Africa, and lots of people, even within your own ancestral story, decided to go to one place and then move to another, and that's common for all Jewish families then as now. And the Litvak Jewish diaspora is one of the most mobile Jewish groups of any group in the world, and they move and continue to move. What we're looking at over here is really a rather congested river now, but at the time, over a century ago when your ancestor came, it was packed full of different types of river craft, naval craft, merchant ships and ocean liners.
And the conditions of the sort of nautical stuff coming by ship, or what
the journey arriving by ship, particularly for your great-grandmother, was one of the most horrific experiences afloat at that time. The vessels in which transported them were often cattle ships converted for the use of transporting third-class migrants. The conditions were overcrowded, were packed, they stank, they had animals or ponies on the deck below them. On the tween deck was where your grandmother, carrying her young children, babes in arms, would have carried them. And often there were even gaps in the floorboards of that deck, meaning effluent from the animals would drop onto the heads of those children. They couldn't even wash, even if something had dropped on them. The journey, of course, from Britain to South Africa was a lot better.
Yeah.
And really, it's a testament to your great-grandfather that he made return journeys, reliving this experience to see his family, that he was a great man.
I really think that until today, I didn't understand how hard the trip would be and how difficult that decision to come all the way from Lithuania to South Africa would be. I always wonder about what makes people do what they do and go where they go. And I mean, they must have had a lot of courage and a lot of foresight to decide to go and then to go. Thank goodness that they actually did it.
Hinda and Hessel's son Charles was just 10 when they made the sea voyage to South Africa. After some 13 years, Charles's family had established a business and put away enough savings to send him to complete his medical studies in Edinburgh. Here, Charles met more than just a future career.
It was an incredibly fast romance. Charlie had come across from South Africa, met Gertie. They fell head over heels for each other, and after 3 days he proposed to her and he had to leave. He had to go back to South Africa. He had to make enough money to be able to get married. And then he came back to Scotland, fetched her, and they'd had this wedding dress made for her. But the moment they got off the ship, she didn't even have a chance to get into this glorious wedding dress that they'd had made before being whisked off to the shul to be married. So she got married in some other outfit, which I think must have been tough on her because, you know, I know the wedding dress at that time was such an important symbolic thing.
In Edinburgh, Jonathan is looking for the apartment where his grandmother Gertie used to stay.
Hello. Hi. I hope you don't mind me disturbing you, but my grandmother used to live here. I'm from South Africa. It's almost a century ago that she lived here. We just found the address, and I'd love it if it was possible to come in and see. I know my grandmother had a lot of siblings, so I can imagine there must have been. You know, I had no idea what sort of place or what sort of size it was that they lived in, but it looks as if there are quite a few rooms. I suddenly had this weird recollection, looking at my own nails, of my grandmother saying that I had her hands. She always used to say that. She used to look at the shape of my nails and compare them, and show me her hands and say, "You have my hands." And she was very proud of that, especially when I started drawing, and she used to love the fact that I had her hands. I had my differences with my grandmother as I became a teenager, and I must say, being here and feeling somehow part of where she lived and grew up, and it does bring me closer to her and to the parts of her that I absolutely loved. That's funny, huh? That is very funny. Sort of a wedding dress standing, looking straight up at her apartment with the wedding dress story. The white wedding dress that she couldn't get into before she got married.
Gertie's father, Abraham, had come from Poland to be the cantor at the Edinburgh Shul. In fact, all Jonathan's roots seem to lead back to Eastern Europe. Now, in a strange reversal of history, Jonathan meets up with his South African wife, Karina, in Lithuania.
Have you gone through customs yet? Brilliant. Okay. See you in a sec. Okay. Hello.
Hi. How are you?
Good. You? Good. It's so lucky that we arrived at the same time now. Huh?
Most records of Jewish life in Lithuania have been burnt in fires or intentionally destroyed by any one of the powers of the day. For some peculiar reason, though, records of Jewish taxes and bank accounts survive. Jonathan and Karina meet up with Ruth at the Kaunas State Archive to see what evidence of the Shapiro or Stüppel families might remain.
And here is Hessel, Leib, Chatzkalowicz, Shapiro, the 30th March 98. And he lives in Plungern in 1908. And you know, he brought to the bank.
So he probably was back there because he had already left.
Yeah.
Then he was back there for a while.
And now look here, he brought money, 3,756 ruble. He brought from abroad, from
South Africa.
South Africa, and put it on the bank.
And that's a lot of money.
Yes, and see what it here. That is his own signature.
Oh, fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Jewish roots in Lithuania date back to the 1300s, when Hessel and Hinder lived in Plungern, and after that, all the way up to the Second World War, Lithuania had a large and vibrant Jewish community of over 200,000 people living in small towns called shtetls. Life included a range of religious and secular activities, and although many Jews were integrated into broader society, anti-Semitism was always a feature. When the Nazis invaded Lithuania in June 1941, they found a population more than eager to collaborate in getting rid of the Jews. In just 4 months, out of a community of 208,000 Jews, over 80% were dead. Less than 13,000 remained. Jonathan is visiting a synagogue in Kaunas, one of the few left standing.
My Jewishness is not what defines me right from the start. But here, I feel connected with those people in that shul. There's a common background. I feel I look like them. I felt uncomfortable because what's happened in the diaspora, and I'm one of those, I'm an example of that, is that I haven't needed to be part of everything that made this kind of tradition here. I've had the choice. I've had an easier time of it, and I've had the choice to take what I want and leave what I want. For some of them, it's a much more dire situation. They've had people forcing them to, well, they've had people killing them, and they've also had people forcing them to forget, forcing them to leave everything that made them what they are. When I stood there last night in the shul and saw them desperately reclaiming what made them, yeah, I don't know. I mean, how much responsibility do I have to keep up any of that tradition? I don't feel a connection with God.
Jonathan travels to Plunian, where he hopes to find a house or a shul or some remnant of his family's history. The only person who can help him is Yakov Bunka, who is literally the last Jew of Plunian.
Hello, Eugenius. It's Jonathan Shapiro here. We have arrived at the block, but I'm not quite sure where you are. Hi, Jonathan. Hi. Thanks for meeting us. And this is my wife, Karina.
Hello, nice to meet you. My father is the last Jew in Colombia, because my mother is Lithuanian. So he's the last Jew.
What?
Here?
Hi, I'm Jonathan Shapiro, and this is my wife, Karina. And it's very, very good to meet you.
On is Jonathan Shapiro, čia mano žmona Karina, ir jums didelė džiaugas tai matydams.
O kas taip čia yra?
Tai, filmuotoja. Atkuvinsiu.
Thank you. This is your work? Oh, it's beautiful. Look at that. These are wonderful.
Different Jewish characters, mostly from different books.
Motel, Shalom Aleichem.
Yes.
Kwas.
Motto.
Holocaust. Holocaust.
Bunka shows Jonathan the Koningstrasse, where Hinda's red brick house would have stood.
Somewhere in this place was your grandparents' house.
But there's no house. The Jewish cemetery that dates back to the 15th century has also been destroyed. A school has been built on top of it. And all 4 shuls are gone.
It's very strange. Just find it empty.
By the time the Nazis reached Plunian in 1941, the 1,800 Jews who had not escaped a month earlier when the Germans had first invaded Lithuania were herded by their neighbors into a shul. They were starved for 2 weeks. Bunka had been one of the few hundred who left just in time. He, his father and brother had escaped through the forest and had reached Russia, where they joined the army to fight against the Nazis. He returned alone to Plunyan when the war was over in 1947. Only 30 Jews remained. Over time, all of them left, but Bunka stayed, determined to document the atrocities from the stories collected from those Jews who survived and those Lithuanians who bore witness.
He started to do what he does on 1947. He said that I can't sleep even, there are lots of hundreds of people shot and there is nothing. They had to do what he has done, I mean, to make the remembrance of the people. He was feeling that in his heart.
Bunka was so determined to create a memorial that despite it being forbidden by the Soviet regime that followed Nazi occupation, he worked secretly at night, carving his 6-meter sculptures, until finally, with the fall of communism, he was permitted to erect his works.
This is like a savior. He's Lithuanian here, this man. There were some Lithuanian people who were trying to give some bread or some food, but they were also exterminated.
It's interesting that you put the suffering of different kinds of people together. I mean, it sort of feels to me like common humanity.
Not all of the people were killing.
Yeah.
No. They took 84 girls, and they took a priest, and well, they made the priest like to change the beliefs, religion. So this is the place where they lay.
So they made them line up, and they said, if you change your religion, we will spare you.
Yes.
And then they said, we will change our religion. And then they took them.
Yes,
And they did. They lived.
But this is the grave. Yeah, they're dead.
They killed them.
Yes.
They made them change their religion, then they killed them.
Yes. This is the girl. It represents the grave of the gods.
The 1,800 men, women and children who were marched from the synagogue into the forest are buried at the mass grave further up the hill.
The
people were shot, and then the other people who were still alive, they were forced to put the ground on those dead and to make a new layer. They were drinking and coming, once are going and coming, and they're changing all the time. You can imagine how many people were still alive, just wounded. I mean, not shot to death, but wounded. And užkasti gyvais.
Bernaras, kaip vardą pavardė, pasakoja, sako, buvo atėję, sako, dar kenuojasi žemė.
There was a man, he came and he told that the ground was moving. I mean, some places of the ground maybe they were moving. That means that the people were buried alive.
I just want to know, while we're standing here, what has it done to your faith? To have seen the things you've seen and to have recorded the things you've recorded.
You can't imagine that God has let these things happen.
Nieks negal šitą pasakyti, kodėl taip buvo.
Nobody can tell why did it happen in this way.
I mean, amazing. I mean, because Bunker is from here, I'm from here. He looks like people I know. There's his father who was born in the year that my grandfather Hessel Leib went to South Africa. And he's back here recording the... I don't know how you can even begin to understand what actually happened here, the atrocity of the Holocaust and of this kind of thing. So yeah, all those people that he knew that are here, and people that if my family had stayed, not only would they, some of them be here, but I wouldn't even exist.
Jonathan came to Plunyan to find his roots, but discovered more than what could have been a violent end to his ancestry. He found Bunker, an artist who, much like Jonathan, draws on a strong sense of moral outrage to record the suffering of all people, whatever their lineage. Like Bunker, Jonathan's moral commitment makes him strongly connected to the place he calls home.
Problems that we have in South Africa haven't made me want to leave, because I landed up in a place that I love. I have become South African, but I can feel the Jewish parts of me and the European parts a lot more.